All right, we are about to get started here. Welcome to another evening lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you are joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, please do leave them in the Q&A box. We will be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your question until the end. If you are joining us in person, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture as well. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. As always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. Thanks tonight to the Society of the Second War with Great Britain in the state of New York and the State of New York Society, United States Daughters of 1812 for co-sponsoring this event. Let me now introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Robert Watson is a historian, frequent news commentator, and author with over 40 published books, several of which have won awards and been featured at literary festivals and in television history documentaries. He has served as a visiting scholar or lecturer at the Pentagon, Smithsonian, West Point, National Archives, Truman Presidential Library, and many other leading museums and battlefields. Watson holds the titles Distinguished Professor of History and Avron Fogelman Research Professor at Lynn University. Today, he will be speaking to us about his book, When Washington Burned, The British Invasion of the Capitol and a Nation's Rise from the Ashes. I'm now going to turn it over to Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Melissa. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you, Melissa, Scott, Peter, for all that you do for history, and all of you for supporting Fraunces Tavern. This is my favorite spot in New York City, which is saying something, right? I love Broadway, love everything else, but Fraunces Tavern is number one. I've had the pleasure of coming here to speak, I think, almost every year for the past 10, 15 years, and then before that, year after year. So it's my go-to spot. I'm excited about this program. This is my latest book, number 48, and just last month found out it won the National Book Award for the Book of the Year. So just got hot off the presses. And the good folks at Fraunces Tavern were kind enough to have a few copies in the back for you. Now, this book is a little different. What I typically do is I try to write at least a book a year. And I lecture on cruise ships. That's sort of my thing, because somebody has to. Right? And I do about 3 a year. Every December, I spend the holidays and New Year's on a ship. And what I do is I always put together 5 possible books for the next year. Why 5? Inevitably, I'll come up, oh, Peter, this is fine too. Any of these, you can have my reserve seat. Why 5? It's inevitable that I'll come up with what I think is a brilliant idea. And then I'll call my literary agent and I'll say, you know, I have this great idea. Are you sitting down? Yeah, I'll pitch it to him. He says, Robert, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? And then I'll come up with, I remember a few years ago, I had a great idea. I was going to do a book on Grant. And I was hosting a series of Pulitzer Prize winning historians for C-SPAN. And I hosted Ron Chernow. And in the green room, I said, what are you working on? He said, a book on Grant. So I went, why bother, right? The other thing that always happens is I'll come up with an idea that I think history has missed. And then I can't find enough primary sources to write the book. If I can't find, especially these days where we're in a post-truth, post-fact world, if I can't find a minimum of 100 primary sources, letters, war reports, diaries, maps, I won't, put a word down. So this book was different. This is the only book I've written where it didn't come out of a December trip. This came out of January 6th. I used to teach at Georgetown. The Capitol is my favorite building in the United States, our Temple of Liberty, right, everybody? Magnificent building. My son used to be a tour guide there when he was in college in DC. So it has special meaning, and it was very, very difficult for me to watch people defecate, urinate, bust out walls, rob, loot, kill police officers in this Temple of Liberty. And I remember my first reaction, and I'm an easygoing guy, I never lose my temper. But my first reaction was I ran out to the garage and I grabbed my wallet and a baseball bat and got in my car. I was going to drive to the Palm Beach airport. I'm from South Florida, and fly to DC and protect the building. And then I started thinking, there won't be a plane ticket. I'll get shot. I'll never make it there. What am I doing? So I decided I needed to write a book about the first time our capital was attacked. And that's where this came from. So to jump into it, we have to go back to the War of 1812. And I know what you're all thinking, War of 1812, time to take a nap. No, War of 1812 is fascinating. My hero, Harry Truman, used to call it, quote unquote, the silliest damn war we ever fought. The War of 1812, it's as if it was run by the Keystone Cops, right? And my students on campus would go, who? And I have to say, Larry, Moe, and Curly, and they go, who? I go, well, never mind. So it was a crazy war. Like many wars, it did not need to be fought. It was a war that was fought for 2.5 years, named for one. And in the end, it was an inglorious tie, and everything went back to the way it was. Now, there are many causes for the war. I'll just touch on a few for the sake of time so we can get into the burning of the Capitol. We all know that elections have consequences, good and bad. The year 1810 was a midterm election. And what happened was a group of Southern conservative war hawks got elected, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and they came into office and disrespected the revolutionary generation. They refused to follow the norms of the gentlemanly norms of Congress, concession, compromise. They refused to pass a budget, if that sounds familiar. They refused to negotiate. It was just a horrific 2 years in Congress. They had one goal, war. They wanted a war. Now, there's one legitimate reason for the war and two illegitimate reasons for the war apropos this election. The legitimate reason for the war was something called impressment. Impressment. So here's what that is. The British are fighting Napoleon in Europe, and the emperor was hell-bent on conquering the whole continent, right? And arguably, Napoleon had the greatest army, but the British had the greatest what? Navy. So the British are going to use their navy to defeat Napoleon's army. How? They want to make 1,000 ships and blockade, this is audacious, blockade every port in Europe. That means Napoleon cannot export, he cannot import. So it's going to be a financial stranglehold. He can't move his army by sea. Got it? Now, here's the problem with 1,000 warships. England is a great place, love it, but it's a relatively small, crowded, resource-poor island. Where are they going to get enough hardwood to make that many ships? Answer, Canada. Canada has enough hardwood to make an unlimited number of ships. So Canada becomes important for the British. More on that later. The British also needed sailors. They knew that some of the greatest sailors in the world were New England fishermen and merchants, right? So what the British did was they would organize press gangs, thus the word impressment. A British warship, a frigate, a man of war, something would pull up beside an American fishing boat, fire a shot across the bow. Now remember, these frigates and brigs and man of wars could have anywhere from 40 to 140 cannons. These things were weapons of mass destruction, right? Then what they would do is the American ship would stop, heave to. They would get a bunch of Marines in a boat and row over to the American ship and at bayonet point, drag them off and say, welcome to His Majesty's Navy. So the British were pressing Americans into service. Now, the British kept meticulous records in most all wars and things they did. However, not with impressment. It took me years of going through archives. There would be 1 month of records, but not the next month. One ship, but not the next ship. I've estimated, and I feel comfortable with my estimate, I believe that 12,000 Americans were pressed into the Navy. That means virtually every little town in New England lost a brother, a father, a son, and a neighbor, right, everybody? 12,000. That's probably reason for war. Now, here's two illegitimate reasons. Mostly Southern hawks. The group of Southerners that gained power, they wanted a war. They wanted to invade Canada for a few reasons. Number one, slavery. If they invade Canada, it's going to distract the country. What they wanted to do was spread slavery, not just around the US, not around North America, the continent, but around the Western Hemisphere. So around 1809-ish, the transatlantic slave trade stops. So if you're a Southern slaver, how are you going to get more slaves? So their thought was, if we invade Canada, then Mexico, then the Southwest, present day Arizona, then Cuba, then Brazil. And these Southern slave owners wanted to make themselves slave emperors in charge of these massive hundreds of thousands of enslaved folks. So that was the plan. Now, you all probably, along with me, we didn't learn about the War of 1812 in school, right? They kind of skipped went from the Revolution to the Civil War. This is the adopted middle child kind of a thing, right? Well, there's a lot of reasons we skipped the War of 1812. One, we didn't win it. Two, we started it. But three, because we were trying to spread slavery everywhere. We don't like to put that in textbooks. I regret to tell you, I'm from Florida, where we ban books. Florida's banned thousands of books now. Diary of Anne Frank, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse Five, J.D. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye, The Color Purple. I mean, it's, Florida's banning books left and right, mostly left. At any rate, we didn't want to, nobody wants to learn about Americans starting a war that we can't win because we want to spread slavery. So that's one of the illegitimate reasons for war. The other one, Native Americans. The same Southern hawks wanted to, not reservations. They didn't want reservations. They didn't want relocation. They wanted extermination. They wanted to pursue a policy of genocide against the indigenous population, men, women, and children. March west and just annihilate and take all that land. So if you fight a war in Canada, that distracts everybody and you can start a program of systematic genocide. So those are the reasons we had the war. Now you know why schools don't put it in the textbooks and we don't like to talk about it. So very, very brutal, difficult reasons for the war. All right, so basically in 1812, we marched 7 armies to Canada and a handful of British officers in Canada, a handful of Indian allies, and a handful of Canadian militiamen beat 7 American armies. We have a 10-to-1 advantage. How is this even possible? Here's the short answer. I'll give you a couple of reasons. One on the far right, that is, in my opinion, well, first off, it's not an accurate statue, but I believe it's the greatest native chief ever. He had the tenacity of a Geronimo, the leadership of a sitting bull or a crazy horse, the eloquence of a Chief Joseph or a Chief Seattle, all wrapped up into a guy that was the size of the rock. That would be Tecumseh. Anybody heard of Tecumseh? Now, in this image, he looks like Wes Studi from Last of the Mohicans, so I'm not sure they did their research when they were, but anyways, guy the size of the rock, that was Tecumseh. Now, Tecumseh learned that the Americans wanted to wipe out all native populations. So he builds a massive native community in Indian territory, today, Indiana. That's where it comes from. And they have horses, they have cattle, they have dogs, they have fields of crops, they have guns, they have everything. And what he does is he wants to gather native tribes from all across the continent to join him to fight the whites. Now, good luck getting everybody to join because native peoples have different languages, different cultures, and many of them were fighting one another for centuries. He wants to organize an alliance, get this, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. And he's successful. He's pulling this off. Why? He knew several Indian dialects. He's charismatic. He's massive. He's a warrior. He's just, and plus he appeals to the enemy of my enemy, right? He's my friend. And he's pulling this off. However, he says we need one more group of native warriors, the Red Sticks. This is one of the most ferocious tribes in history. They're around present-day Alabama, Mississippi, named Red Sticks because their clubs were red at the end from all the brains they bashed in. And these are just ferocious warriors. So Tecumseh says, I'm going to leave and travel to the Gulf of Mexico, recruit the Red Sticks, come back to Indian territory, and we'll start the war against the whites. Now, whites hear about this and know what Tecumseh's up to, so they're panicked. They send an obscure general from the West named William Henry Harrison to keep his eye on Tecumseh. So he travels to a creek nearby Tecumseh's stronghold called Tippecanoe Creek. Now your civics classes are all coming back, right? Tippecanoe and Tyler too. When William Henry Harrison runs for president in 1840, his VP was John Tyler. That's where that comes from. So William Henry Harrison goes to keep an eye on Tecumseh and sees Tecumseh leave. Tecumseh goes to the Gulf. Tecumseh leaves in charge of this massive Indian confederation a guy called the Prophet. The Prophet is a snake oil salesman. He's like a televangelist. So what he does, the Prophet finds out from whites that there's an eclipse coming in X number of days. So he falls on the ground in good acting and announces that he died, spoke to the chiefs in the clouds, and they've given him powers to control the sun, the moon, and the planets. So in 3 days, I'm going to demonstrate my powers and bring it together. And there was an eclipse. So everybody believed him, right? That's who's in charge. Now, what the Prophet does is Tecumseh basically told the Prophet what I told my own kids the first time I went away and left them home unsupervised. Don't do anything. Don't touch anything. Don't answer the phone. Don't turn the oven on. Just sit, right, parents? So he tells the Prophet, don't do anything. As soon as he leaves, the Prophet has a giant party. The red man's herbs, the white man's alcohol, has a giant party. Everybody is completely obliterated. He falls on the ground in the middle of the party. They think he's dead. He comes to and says, I've again spoken to the chiefs in the clouds. This time I can make you invisible. So in the middle of a drunken stupor, with no planning, he orders them to charge William Henry Harrison's army. William Henry Harrison's army just lines up like shooting fish in a barrel. And in an hour, everything it took Tecumseh years to build is gone. Then they march on the Indian village and they burn it to the ground. They kill cows, horses, dogs, the elderly, everyone. Tecumseh comes back with the red sticks and sees all that he had worked on. So he beats the Prophet savagely and bans him. A couple of years later, he shows up in present-day Idaho, but basically that's it. Tecumseh then vows, I will fight William Henry Harrison and the Americans to my death. So he joins the Canadians with the red sticks. Now, if you got Tecumseh on your side, it's like having a basketball team with Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, and LeBron all on the team, right? You're going to win some games. Tecumseh and the red sticks join the Canadians and the Brits. So when we invade, we have to tangle with this great warrior and strategist. The guy in the middle, any Canadians here? You know General Isaac Brock. Isaac Brock. This is Canada's George Washington, basically. Young, handsome, dashing, a great military man, brave, a good strategist. Brock. Brock is cursing his misfortune. He's a young up-and-coming officer. He wants to be in Europe fighting Napoleon. That's where all the glory is. Instead, he's stuck in Canada. And Canada in 1812 had a population of, I think it's 18, maybe 19, right? So he's cursing his misfortune of being stuck in Canada. But when the Americans attack, they have him. So they basically have Michael Jordan and LeBron between these two guys. Brock and Tecumseh become besties. They become buds. You can see Tecumseh is wearing Brock's gold neck piece. Tecumseh takes off his red do-rag and Brock wears it as a sash. Tecumseh has this chest plate with bones of his enemies. Brock puts it over his general's uniform. Can you imagine the staid British officers? They're in a full-scale meltdown. So they become very close and they work together. So our armies march into Canada and these two find a way of whooping everyone. I'll give you one example. The guy on the left is an American general, Granny Hall, okay? Hall is in charge of our Western defenses. The Wild Wild West back then would be Detroit. So he's in charge of Fort Detroit. He's told to march his army across Canada and slice Canada in two, right? There's nothing they can do about it. He has a massive army. The problem is he's incompetent and a coward. He moves at glacial speed. And it turns out Hall has had a lifelong nightmare that he's going to be scalped by Indians. So what he does is he moves slowly because he has scouts all around the front of the army looking for Indians. And he gave them instructions, look out, I need to know where they are because they're coming to scout me. He's so dumb that he writes their orders and gives them orders, uh-oh, I'm going to be scalped. They're carrying it in their leather satchels. So what happens is Tecumseh catches General Hall's scouts, brings them back to Brock. He opens up the satchel and says, oh my goodness, this guy's literally this dumb and incompetent. He writes that he's worried about being scalped. I have an idea. Why don't we scalp his men and send them back to him? So can you imagine the fear of Hall when a guy comes back on a horse strapped to the horse and his scalp is pinned onto his uniform. So Hall stops the entire army and makes camp and puts men in a 360 ring saying, watch out, I'm going to be scalped. Tecumseh and Brock seize them, scalp them. Now, Hall's in a full-scale panic. Without firing a shot, he marches his entire army back to Detroit and shuts the door. Brock gets Tecumseh to get his fastest horses and his bravest warriors, and they race to Fort Detroit. They arrive at the same time. They don't have many men. But what Brock tells Tecumseh to do is put your warriors one at a time in a circle in the woods around the fort and light fires and chant and sing war songs all night long. Inside the fort, Hall thinks the entire Indian nation is coming for him when it's only a couple of guys with campfires. In the morning, they get up, and out front of the fort is Brock and Tecumseh with the white flag, not of surrender, of parley. Hall comes out, and Brock basically says to him, this is going to go down one or two ways. Number one, you can surrender now, and you'll live, and your men will live, and I'm an honorable officer. Number two, you fight, I will not control Tecumseh's appetite for flesh. In other words, he'll eat you. And I'm sure Tecumseh's, trying to bite his knuckles so he doesn't laugh. Hall surrenders the entire fort without a shot being fired. So that's an example of how Brock and Tecumseh beat all these American armies, and this is not going well for us. Here's an artist's depiction of the surrender. One of my hobbies is fact-checking movies and paintings. So you don't want to go to a movie with me because I'll yell out in the middle of the movie, that's the wrong cannon. People will be like, shh. You didn't want to see Oppenheimer with me because the depiction of Harry Truman was awful, and I had to announce it to the whole theater. At any rate, there's them surrendering. The Americans didn't have all the matching uniforms, and there wasn't a massive British army, so this is not accurate. Nonetheless, they surrendered. So let's, there's, anybody been to the National Portrait Gallery in DC, part of the Smithsonian? One of my favorites. My favorite depiction of Tecumseh, because it's the only one that I think reveals his power, size, and charisma, is this of Tecumseh dying. So I put that in there just so you could get a better indication of how remarkable Tecumseh was. So fast forward to 1813, 1 year before the Capitol's burned, second year of the war. Things are looking good for the US. Why? Three reasons. One, Tecumseh's dead. It's at the Battle of Thames on the Canadian border, named for the river in London. William Henry Harrison shows up with a massive group on horseback. There's a couple Canadians, a couple of Indians, so they run. Tecumseh doesn't have the word retreat in his vocabulary. He stands his ground and is killed. So later, when William Henry Harrison would run for president in 1840, it was in some ways kind of the first modern presidential campaign, in that they made up ditties like Tippecanoe and Tyler too. They made up songs and stories. They said William Henry Harrison, who, by the way, was the oldest president at the time ever elected, something we can all relate to, right? He'd be the oldest president all the way until Reagan. So William Henry Harrison, they said, when he would travel through the woods and Indians would try to attack him, he'd make them wait until he tied one hand behind his back to make it fair. And I'm glad you're seated because people believed it. You can tell the American public anything, right? They also said that in his free time, he'd wrestle bears. And then all the bears would sit on his front porch and they'd all drink hard cider together. But here's my favorite. He killed Tecumseh with his bare hands. Now, Tecumseh looked like The Rock. William Henry Harrison looked like Bernie Sanders. So I don't think, we know that didn't happen. Anyway, so in 1813, Tecumseh's dead. Number two, General Brock is dead. At Queenston Heights near Niagara Falls, the Americans have the high ground. So Brock wants his men to charge up and seize the high ground. Military history, right, everybody? Person that has the high ground wins. But because he's Brock, he doesn't send his army up. He leads them up, and he's shot and killed. So without Brock and Tecumseh, we stand a chance. Also, we finally found a good general instead of all these incompetent cowards. We found a guy, he's kind of like Clark in Lewis and Clark. You know, Meriwether Lewis was the intellectual that read and spoke Latin and Greek and, was a botanist and an architect, played the violin. Clark was the big tough guy that could fight Indians, knew the language, navigate by the stars and all that. This explorer, He found the root of the source of a lot of rivers. He found a famous peak in Colorado. That would be General Pike, Zebulon Pike. He's young, he's tough, he's handsome, he's a great general. So what he does, he gets an armada of warships and we cross the Great Lakes and we're going to attack the Canadian capital of York, present location, Toronto. So it doesn't really look like Toronto there much anymore, right? Population then, probably 7 people, I'm not sure, right? So he's going to attack York. Now, Zebulon Pike makes quick work of Fort York and everything and is winning. The battle's almost over. He brings his prisoners out and sits them on a rock with him. He says, listen, if you surrender now, you have my word and honor, I will protect you. And he would have. I will feed everyone. I will care for everyone. And Zebulon Pike would have, no question. As he's sitting there negotiating, one of the warships shoots a cannonball. It sails overhead, goes into the fort, hits the arms depot, the powder magazine, where there's tons of powder. It lights it, and an explosion. It's one of the great explosions of history. It levels trees. It knocks every wall of the fort outward onto the ground. Bodies and body parts are sent flying into the air. Anyone not dead is deaf. More men on both sides died in the explosion than died in the fight. And an American surgeon who was treating all the wounded wrote that not only did bodies and body parts come flying up, but a rock, he said, the size of a harpsichord came flying out of the ground as if launched by a trebuchet, a catapult. It flew and it landed on Zebulon Pike, the general's head, and squished him flat as a pancake, killed him. With Pike dead, the American soldiers were frustrated. They had lost every battle. The same Southern war hawks that got us into the war voted down the budget for the war. So men lacked food, they lacked uniforms, typical, right? So the men were frustrated, they were angry. So what did we do to York? We raped, pillaged, and burned it to the ground. So we burned the Canadian capital. Now there's your answer on one of the reasons why our capital was burned. So the British said, we will remember that. That's 1813. Fast forward, that's Fort York. You can see not much of a fort, a blockhouse, a small wall in the back. That's Zebulon Pike and an artist's depiction of the explosion, and a rock is headed towards Zebulon Pike. Fast forward to 1814. Now, things look really bad for us. Why? The British beat Napoleon. That means with Napoleon out of the way, they can send their armies to the United States and deal with these pesky Americans that keep trying to invade Canada. Tens of thousands, a flotilla of warships. The army that beat Napoleon sails for the US. And they're under the command of this guy, Robert Ross, an Irishman, who's one of the best generals. He's basically one of the generals that beat Napoleon. We had a 10-to-1 advantage and lose everything. Now he's going to have a 10-to-1 advantage. We are in trouble. There's nothing we can do. He plans a 3-pronged invasion. Prong 1 is going to come down from Canada and hit around Lake Champlain, Vermont, and New York, and then slice the Northeast off from the rest of the country. Prong 2 is going to come up from New Orleans, take the Mississippi River. That's important. Prong 3, which Ross is leading, is going to hit us in the gut, the Chesapeake. We have 2 targets, Ross said, in Chesapeake, Washington and Baltimore. Washington, because it's the capital. Baltimore is a much more populated, important place with Fort McHenry, our most important fort, and our Navy and all that in Baltimore. And there's nothing we can do. Making things worse for us, not only is Ross in command, but his deputy is Admiral Coburn. This guy's vicious, kind of a Dracula figure. He wants blood. He wants women and children killed. He wants to recolonize us. Coburn arrives a few weeks before Ross. So he sails his warships around the Potomac and Chesapeake, just arbitrarily bombing civilian homes, burning villages, killing people. So he's instilling fear in everybody. This is what's coming for us. So here's a map of the, thankfully, Melissa showed me how to operate this earlier. My line was, how many PhDs does it take to, So here's the map. They land in Eastern Shore, Tidewater, Maryland. They're going to march one army, you can see the lower one, to Washington. Then they're going to sail up and hit Baltimore. Remember, Baltimore is the more important target because Washington, D.C. was not the grand city that it is today. It was a cultural backwater. So Ross rushes with his army, only 3 days rations. He said, we're going to hit them before they know what happened. He makes it to Bladensburg, which is about 6 miles east of D.C. They arrive in Bladensburg, and we finally mount a defense in Bladensburg. Here's the problem for the United States. James Madison, the president, our 4th president, hired some of the most incompetent people in history. And we know that if you hire incompetent people, there's consequences. The guy on the left is William Winder. He was the general in charge. What Winder does when we arrive in Bladensburg is he runs. And then later when the British arrive in Bladensburg, he runs. Then the British go to Baltimore and he runs again. So he runs away. The guy on the right is Armstrong. He's the Secretary of War. Today we would say Defense. Truman changed the title after World War II. Armstrong, when he knows the British are coming, he runs, goes to present-day West Virginia to a spa. So this is our military leadership. So we have nothing going on, basically. So that brings us to the Battle of Bladensburg. Now, this painting's inaccurate because it shows the Americans in blue uniforms. We weren't. It was farmers, clerks, and blacksmiths wearing civilian clothing. What is accurate is in the middle of running horizontally, right in the middle, you can see a tree line. There's a river, one river. And there's one bridge across. So now, all of us in this room, if we each had a rifle and enough ammo, we could have held off the entire British army. Why? Because a bridge is what? A natural choke point, killing point. You can only run across it a few men at a time. A colonel and some men rush across the bridge. They're slaughtered before they make it across the bridge. So General Ross orders the British army to halt. And he gets his field glasses and he wants to see what he's up against. And he realizes none of the Americans are wearing uniforms. They have lousy positions and lines. They don't take the high ground. They haven't seized the entrance to the bridge or the exit to the bridge. They don't have the cannons in the right places. So he says, oh my gosh, we're dealing with farmers and blacksmiths. So he said, I have an idea. Before we attack, he brought along some Congreve rockets. A Congreve rocket is basically a fireworks display. Doesn't really do anything. It's a psychological weapon. So you can see in the back, Ross says, before we try it again, let's fire some rockets. The rockets blow up. 6,500 Americans drop their guns and run for their lives. Historians don't call this the Battle of Bladensburg. We call it the Bladensburg Races. Ross wrote that he couldn't catch us because 1, we ran too fast. 2, he said it was too humid. Anybody been to Washington in the late summer? It's even more hot and humid than where I'm from, which is South Florida, right? Plus the British are wearing wool uniforms. Ross wrote that the Americans ran like sheep before wolves. So we ran. Now at the bottom right of the screen, you can see a road. Right at the end of it where the painting stops was a gate. And that road, the big gate, led into 3 roads. One went to Georgetown, one went to Tenleytown, that's up on the hill, Embassy Row, Massachusetts Avenue, where American University is today, and the 3rd one to Washington, D.C. Now, what happened is our soldiers and horses and wagons rush to flee the battlefield. More men are injured and killed at the gate than in the battle. It's an absolute embarrassment as they're trying to run from it. President Madison was in the back of the army with James Monroe, as Secretary of State, who would be our 5th president, watching the battle. Madison's horse is spooked and he's thrown from the horse and almost trampled to death. Now, how embarrassing. It would have been easy to trample Madison. He was our smallest president. They called him the Great Little Madison. He was 5'4" and weighed weighed 100 pounds. Albert Gallatin, the Treasury Secretary, used to say of Madison's formidable intellect, but diminutive size, he would say, so much mind, so little matter, which is cute. Anyways, Madison is almost trampled to death. The army runs. It's an embarrassment. Our army is nearly slaughtered by being shot in the back, except it was too hot and we had 3 heroes. I'm going to profile 3 heroes, lest it's all doom and gloom. Here's the first hero, Joshua Barney, Commodore Barney. So Barney wants to try to hold off the British while they're out in the Chesapeake. Remember, Admiral Coburn was attacking villages. The problem is he has a few sailors and a few Marines and a few former enslaved guys in his force. He can't build a warship. So he launches what he calls Barney's Flying Barges. I think he needed a marketing person to rebrand that a little bit, right? So what it is, it's a barge with a bunch of people rowing. He would strap one cannon on it. If you've been to the DC area, you know there's an infinite amount of estuaries, creeks, and waterways. He would hide in them and then row out really quickly and fire a cannon and hit the British warship, row back, and the big ship couldn't make it into the creek or estuary. So like a bunch of hornets bothering a grizzly bear. Now, Admiral Coburn should have just left him alone and attacked Washington, but he couldn't avoid the fight. So Barney actually holds them off long enough to put 6,500 men in the field, all of whom sadly ran. Finally, Coburn catches Barney's squadron and sinks it and kills most of his men. Barney and a few men managed to escape with a couple of small cannons. They dragged the cannons miles, dragging a cannon. Again, naval cannons have the little wheels, not the big wheels as like a Civil War era cannon or something. They drag them to Bladensburg and they arrive when the fighting starts. Along the way, Barney meets one of the War Department officials that tells him, "You go guard a bridge." Barney says, "The fighting is over there. We need to stop Ross and Coburn. You go guard a bridge or we'll strip you of your command." As soon as the officer left, Barney took his men to Bladensburg where they were needed. As the Americans were running and the British were advancing, Barney grabs the high ground on the side of the road, and he and his few Marines and former slaves hold off the whole British army. It's an extraordinary act. Barney is shot multiple times. This painting is partly accurate. The tall man in blue in the back is Admiral Coburn. The man in red kneeling is General Ross, the two British commanders. They are so taken by Barney's defense and heroism that they stop the battle and order that he medically be treated by their personal physicians. You can see the problem is they have a Civil War cannon there. This is 1814, so wrong war, wrong year. But Barney and his men pretty much fight to the last man and hold off Ross. He's our first great hero. Here's our second hero, the wife of President James Madison, the great Dolly Madison, right? Dolly. So it's hard to believe, but Dolly was raised a Quaker. And then boy, would she be a pistol. Dolly was famous for her cleavage revealing dresses, too much makeup, chewed snuff, drank, opinionated, flirtatious. Can you say Mae West? Of course, my students would go, who? Right? So Dolly was quite something. She was the hostess with the mostest. Her parties were nicknamed the Squeeze or the Crush because so many people wanted to go to her parties. Dolly knew that the political was the social and the social was the political. She knew that members of Congress did not make a decision on how they're going to vote while sitting in the hall of the House, the floor of the House. They made their decision over bourbon and dinner 2 weekends before. So what she would do at her parties is she would sit people strategically at each table. And Dolly was nicknamed Queen Dolly. She even wore sometimes a purple turban. And if that wasn't enough, she sometimes put peacock plumes in the purple turban. Doesn't everybody have an aunt like that? Right? I had two. So at any rate, Dolly had Queen Dolly's court, they called them. She'd get about a dozen young debutantes when that was a thing. And they would all kind of swish around behind Dolly wearing cleavage revealing tops. She would meet with all these young women before each party and sit them strategically. You're sitting with Senator so-and-so, you're sitting with Congressman so-and-so. I need you to find out how they're going to vote on these three bills, why not, what negotiations would be amenable to them. Now, we all know that older male politicians do really dumb things around attractive young women. Could you imagine in the year 1812? This was low-hanging fruit. This was easy pickings. So these young girls would sit and play dumb. What's the vote? And then they'd find all the information for Dolly. Dolly gave the young women 2 bits of advice. She said, if you're not able to get what I need, bat your eyelashes. She said, if all else fails, bend over. But get me the information, the incomparable Dolly Madison. It was always said that Madison had his finger on the pulse. Dolly had her finger on the pulse. Madison was a brilliant framer, but kind of a socially awkward professorial type, with all due respect to my occupation. So Dolly is back at the White House with a young male and female slave and an usher, French John, they call it. And Madison is worried she's going to be captured, burned, or killed, right? He sends a rider to fetch her and get her out of the White House. She refuses and sends the rider back with a letter that survived history. I reprinted it in my book. She said, quote unquote, I refuse to abandon my post, right? Now, Madison sent a colonel and 100 soldiers to surround the White House to protect her. They all run. She's out there yelling out the window at him, you get back and fight. She writes a letter to a friend saying the only ones left are a couple of ladies. She said, but if us ladies, if we had enough cannons, we'd defend the city. Dolly. So even though Dolly knows the British are coming, she climbs on the roof of the White House with a spyglass, like a Douglas Fairbanks, and my students would say, who? I have to say Johnny Depp. So with the spyglass, she sees a huge dust cloud marching into the city. What's the dust cloud? Thousands of British boots. It was dry. So she knows it's done. Rather than flee, she orders her 3 staffers to preserve, to collect all the priceless artifacts of the White House. In the background, the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait of George Washington in black silk, right? She won't even let them cut it out of the frame. They have to get a hatchet, break the frame. She won't even let them roll it up. He has to lie it flat on a wagon. Satisfied that all the priceless objects are out, only then at the 11th hour does she flee. She risked her life for history. That's my gal, right? Dolly, an extraordinary act. She saved history. That was the young male enslaved worker, Paul Jennings. Happily, he lived through it. Happily, later in life, he's freed. Happily, he learned to read and write. And happily, he wrote one heck of a firsthand account of everything that happened in the White House that day, as did Dolly. So we know exactly what happened. Here's our third of 3 heroes, Stephen Pleasanton. I dedicated my book to him. This is him later in life. When he was about 20, he was a clerk in the Capitol building in charge of the Library of Congress. Now, today we have a magnificent Library of Congress with a team of professional archives. Back then, we had a couple of clerks. Pleasanton and every other clerk was given a musket and conscripted into the army and told, run to Bladensburg and dig in. He said, I'm not leaving the Capitol. My work is here. They threatened the court-martialing. They had to drag him to Bladensburg. When he arrives in Bladensburg, he announces, I'm leaving. His commanding officer was a colonel named Magruder. Magruder said, well, then I'm court-martialing you. He said, do it, because I'm leaving. As they're arguing and he's about to be arrested, court-martialed, somebody yells, and here comes the British across the bridge at Bladensburg. So Colonel Magruder and the Americans had bigger fish to fry. They leave Stephen Pleasanton alone, who runs 6 miles back to Washington. Why? He saves the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, which turns 250 in 2026. He saves the Bill of Rights, George Washington's letters and artifacts. He saves our national treasures. He has very little time to do it. He's running around the Capitol deciding what gets burned, what gets saved. Wow, what a heady experience, right? Fortunately, he chose wisely. Now, he has too much stuff to carry, but he needs to get a horse and a wagon, but all the horses and wagons are gone. Everybody fled the city. So he goes running around outside the city, finds a barn. He has a cow and a 2-wheeled ox cart. He hooks the cart up to the cow. Can you imagine how frustratingly slow, the cow, come on, Betsy. So they go back, he loads it up, and he sees the British coming in. There's 2 roads in and out of Washington at the time. He takes the other road, and as he's leaving, the wheel falls off the ox cart. Fortunately, he's like a MacGyver, and my students would say, who, right? He finds a blacksmith shop. The blacksmith had run away, gets all the tools, he fixes the wagon, and he rides for 24 hours. He hides our national artifacts in a barn in the middle of nowhere in Virginia. And then he sleeps for an entire day and night in a boarding house. Doesn't tell anyone. Leaves it there for weeks, satisfied the British aren't coming back. Only then does Stephen Pleasanton go back and get everything. So this young man saved our national heritage. Today, he'd probably be working at Fraunces Tavern Museum, right? However, he worked for Congress, and every year for the rest of his career, he asked for promotion and a pay raise. And because he worked for Congress, the answer was no. Some things never change. It was Congress. So he retires in debt, lowly forgotten. And one of my goals for the book was not just to win an award, but to have history remember Stephen Pleasant. So let's move to the end. August 24th, 1814 at 8 p.m., General Ross and the British march into Washington and burn the White House and the Capitol. Later, they burn the Treasury, War, and State Departments. We lose our Navy yards. Part of the city catches fire. Now they launched, remember the Congreve rockets? They launched the rockets onto the roof of the Capitol and White House, but they wouldn't burn. So what they had to do is they went into the White House and Capitol, opened up books, broke out wooden door frames, broke desks, made of piles, poured the rocket fuel on it, and lit it. Now, both General Ross and Admiral Cockburn, the two British officials, said that that night, August 24th, 1814, was the windiest night of their lives. And I like this image here because you can see the winds whipping these. As soon as they lit the fires, both the Capitol and the White House were engulfed in flames. Here's a diorama. I like the depiction of it's tragic, isn't it? The White House engulfed in flames. Here's my favorite image. Isn't that beautiful and powerful? It's amazing, right, everyone? I went to my editor at Georgetown University Press and I said, Don, this is the cover of the book. He said, no, we have another idea. I said, no. This is the cover of the book. He said, no, we have another idea. I said, Don, he said, Robert, when you're David McCullough, you can pick the cover of your book. Like, all right. So I did get it in the book somewhere. But at any rate, the city catches fire. Now, I taught at Georgetown. A lot of you have been to the area. It's not an area prone to tornadoes. Yet not one, but two tornadoes touched down. We have multiple accounts from Ross Cockburn and everybody else. The Londoners never saw a tornado. They describe a scene that sounds like the Wicked Witch and the Wizard of Oz, right? One of the officers rides up and he's yelling orders with the sword. Nobody can hear a thing he's saying over the roar of the tornado. Suddenly, he and the horse just go flying. More British were injured in the tornado than in the battle for the city. It really unnerved them. Buildings are knocked over, trees are uprooted. One British soldier who was lifted up by the tornado and thrown obviously has post-traumatic stress. He's running around screaming, but he's screaming, these are not tornadoes. These are the fingers of George Washington coming down to defend his city. That unnerved the British. When the tornadoes stop, a thunderstorm breaks out and it puts the fires out. Everybody's soaked and scared. The British decide to leave the city. So now they're heading to their main target, which was Baltimore, remember? So they're going to do a two-pronged attack on Baltimore. Prong one, Admiral Cockburn's going to sail in to Baltimore near what is today Inner Harbor, right? I think he wanted to get reservations at the Cheesecake Factory, probably. Number two, Ross is marching in by land, right? Now, we have a spy. His name is Dr. Beans, not Mr. Bean. Dr. Beans, he's a Scotsman, a physician who switches sides and spies for us. He lets us know where Ross is marching into the city. So we go and prepare. He lets us know that Cockburn's sailing in at sunset. We know everything. So what we do is there's two grumpy old Revolutionary War veterans in Baltimore, Smith and Stricker. They remind me of the two old guys from the Muppets, right? One of them, even a painting, he looks like Ernest Borgnine. And my students would say, who? Yeah. So he looks like Ernest Borgnine. Anyway, Smith and Stricker say we're not surrendering the city. Here's what they do. They confiscate every boat. They sink them in a seawall at the entrance to Baltimore. The British can't sail in. They have to anchor way out there and launch from afar. Number two, he knew from Dr. Beans they're going to hit us at night. At night, how do you target with primitive artillery and communications? Target lights. So Smith and Stricker order every candle and lantern be snuffed out. Then they hang them in the woods way over there so the British blow the woods up. Number three, they knew that our men would not be disciplined because they're just, blacksmiths and carpenters. They wouldn't be disciplined to hold the line in a British attack. So they said, we're going to do the last thing Ross expects. We're going to attack them. They knew the ground, the lay of the land. The British march on the road, it takes a bend. They can't see around the bend, and the road narrows to smaller than this room here. So they're funneled in. Our men are waiting on the sides with sickles and hammers and axes, shovels. It's going to be medieval. The British turn around the corner. They're hot, the humidity, and they're attacked, and they start to panic and retreat. In the back, General Ross screams, "I don't give a damn if it rains militia," end quote. He said, "I will supper tonight in Baltimore or in hell," end quote. Be careful what you wish for. He starts riding to the front and he's shot through the chest and killed instantly. With Ross dead, with the medieval warfare, the British unnerved, they retreat. We hold. But now we have the sea. So the British sailing, the Fort McHenry, you can see it there in the middle. They're going to bomb Baltimore. They have to go bomb from way out at sea because of the seawall. But before Coburn starts bombing, he wants to catch this spy, Dr. Beans. So they arrest him. They bring him on board the flagship, the HMS Tonnant, Tonnant. And they try him and they find him guilty. They're going to kill him. But Coburn says, "Not until the morning. We're going to make you stand on deck and watch us reduce Baltimore and Fort McHenry to rubble." Now, the Americans are worried. They have to do something. So they do two things. Inside Fort McHenry, President Madison was so incompetent. Our garrison is about 30% troop strength. Many of the cannons don't have a platform to fire. And we don't have a general or a colonel in command. We have a 20-something major named Armistead. Armistead knows as soon as the British open fire, there's nothing they can do and his men will run. So he wants to inspire them. So he approaches a flag maker named Mary Pickersgill and has her make the biggest flag ever made. You can see it today in the Smithsonian. Everybody, Old Glory, Stars and Stripes, still survives. He wants it flown on top of Fort McHenry, big enough to inspire our men, inspire the people of Baltimore, and let the British see it and know that we're still here. The other thing we do is we want to save Dr. Beans, so they take up a collection and they find a young lawyer. He's a handsome fellow. He's the George Clooney of the day, right? And he's a part-time poet. You can see him over there on the painting that Scott and Melissa put out. His name is Francis Scott Key. So Key goes out to negotiate for Dr. Beans's life, and Key does so well, they say, "Okay, we won't kill Dr. Beans, but you and Dr. Beans have to stand on deck all night and watch us destroy Baltimore and Fort McHenry." So all night long, Francis Scott Key paced the decks. Remember the Congreve rockets? Watching the rockets watching the bombs. And his only hope was that in the morning that our flag would still be there. And it was. And we held. And he was so inspired, he quilled a parchment and wrote a poem about it called "Oh Say Can You See." And we didn't have a national anthem. We got our butts whooped. It was an embarrassing war, so we needed something to feel good about ourselves. Plus, all the women loved Francis Scott Clooney. So we made it our national anthem. We needed a melody for our national anthem, something everybody knew. We didn't have a lot of Mozarts and Beethovens. So they borrowed a British drunk tavern song called "Old Anacreon in Heaven." It's basically the 17 and 1800s version of karaoke, right? Everybody would get drunk and get up instead of "Sweet Caroline." Okay, let's try it again. "Sweet Caroline." Okay. You'd get up and sing "Old Anacreon in Heaven," and the melody was da 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 da, and nobody could hit those notes, right? So you make a fool of yourself, and that was our national anthem. In closing, America held. There's Francis Scott Clooney. That's the White House being rebuilt, and that's the cover of the book. At any rate, I'll close by just saying, if you could take a time machine back to 1790, 1800, 1811, and meet Mr. Jefferson and ask him about his country, he would answer, "Virginia." We were a collection of states. I've written a lot of books in the 17 and 1800s. At this time, when people wrote about the states, this is what they would write: "These," THESE, united, small letter U, "states," capital letter S, "these," plural, "states." After this, we beat the British, or so we said. We rebuilt the city better than before. We survived. They started writing "the," singular, united, capital letter U, noun, states. It imbued us with a sense of national identity. And textbooks sometimes record that President Madison climbed the burned out steps of the building and delivered a Winston Churchill type of, we will endure kind of a speech. You go back and you read the letters, it was Mrs. Madison who said, we will rebuild, we will endure, we will. And the rest, as they say, is history. Thank you.
Gorgeous.
Left for a Q&A. So a reminder to those of us joining us on Zoom to please feel free to share your questions in the Q&A function. And let's start with a question from the room here, if anybody has one.
You spoke about the impressment and like 12,000 men being impressed. Wouldn't there be a risk from the British point of view of having too many impressed men on a ship where they might mutiny, take it over, certainly are not going to be incented to fight?
Great observation. The answer is absolutely yes. So what the British did was a couple things. One, cruelty. There's no rights on a naval warship. The commanding officer is God, period. There is nothing beyond that. Beatings, floggings. The other thing they did was they had a few American sailors on each ship. So they wouldn't have one ship that was crewed by 80% Americans, or you risk a mutiny. They spread it out. Remember, they wanted to make dozens of brigs, dozens of man of wars, dozens of frigates, and ultimately hundreds, if not 1,000 ships. And the 12,000 number, I estimate that over a 12-year period from 1800 to 1812. That's a lot, though. Thinking about the population of New England, whereas, as I said earlier, virtually every town lost sons in that. So the British took a risk. They saw the more imminent risk, Napoleon. Napoleon was going to win the war in Europe, if not for his megalomania and everything else, as Waterloo ultimately. But they needed to do whatever it took to make sure they won that war. So yeah, good point, Peter. It was an extraordinary risk, but one worth taking to stop Napoleon. Good.
I have a question here from an attendee on Zoom who asks, what would have happened if there was a decisive victory on either side?
Yeah, there really wasn't a decisive victory on either side at that particular point. If the British had won, it would have changed everything. Especially Coburn, the number 2 behind Ross, he wanted to recolonize. We were on our knees. The army that came down from Canada had at least a 5-to-1 advantage. And we had a young general defending what is Champlain and a couple of young sailors on the lake. And against all odds, we beat them. And the British made every mistake in the book. What we did is they had, as I said, minimum 5-to-1, if not more, advantage. What we did is they were coming toward this one little fort on the edge of Lake Champlain. We felled trees to funnel them in. We made them come in the way we wanted them to come in, and that was across the swamp, a bog. And the British were led by an incompetent general he was a politician, he took a command, who marched them into a bog. Our men were waiting on either side and then popped up above the fort, and they annihilated the British, who then with 32,000 men retreated back to Canada. Ultimately, that officer was court-martialed and died on the eve of his court-martial. So had they had that, we could have been a British colony. The War of 1812 was probably as close, think about it, a great general and a powerful British army occupying Washington, D.C., the city's on fire, and our army is on the run. This is the closest we came to ceasing to exist. So another decisive victory, that would have been all she wrote. What the War of 1812 was it was a great war for Canada. It would begin to plant the seeds for Canadian independence. Canada held off all these armies. The real losers of the war, the native population. This is the beginning of the end of native autonomy, sovereignty, and independence, and they lose to Tecumseh and all their other great chiefs. So yeah, no decisive war at that particular, a battle at that particular time. But yeah, boy, you think about how close we came. Alarming.
Any more questions in the room?
If you talk long enough, you'll cover all that.
I'm not really sure how to frame the question, but what was France's position like during Napoleon, like in the Revolutionary War, they're obviously involved, and then what happened post Napoleon?
Good.
what was their role?
So France had their own revolution several years after ours, inspired by ours, but France's revolution was bloody and chaotic compared to ours. Yeah, we tar and feathered people, and I don't mean to make light of that. Stripping someone, pouring burning tar on them, they suffered multiple degree burns on their body. Many of them died. But our revolution was rather orderly and peaceful compared to France's. Blood was in the streets. Anybody of means was dragged to the Bastille and guillotined. So it was brutal. In the vacuum of the French Revolution, when there was no order and it was chaos, that's when Napoleon emerges and seizes power. Napoleon seizes power by being brutal on the battlefield. He opens fire into unarmed civilians. He just does whatever it takes. And then they wanted the strong man. So they backed Napoleon, who makes himself emperor. After Napoleon, France is again in a period of turmoil through its various republics where they can't find a system and a way to govern. So France actually took longer than we did to figure it out. And let me preface that by saying, I always say that it took us a long time to figure it out. We had a civil war on the way, right? I often sometimes write and say we didn't figure it out until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, before we the people meant all the people, right? But France took quite a while, so they were in complete turmoil. Napoleon was winning, and not unlike Hitler, Napoleon was a megalomaniac and a narcissist who wouldn't listen to his generals. Hitler and Napoleon always said they knew more than their generals. And Napoleon wrote that you can't fight a war on two fronts. And he tried to fight a war on multiple fronts, and it was his undoing. Hitler read Napoleon and said, I can't fight a war on more than two fronts. And he fought a war on the Eastern, Western, and the North African front. So Napoleon's megalomania, thank goodness, undermined him because he was winning. The same way, if you go back to, before Hitler ordered Operation Barbarossa, which is the invasion of Soviet Union, right? He dominated Europe. Sweden and Switzerland were neutral. The Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal were fascist stooges for Hitler. It was Britain against all of Europe. It was all Nazi occupied. But Hitler ends up attacking the Soviet Union and is a victim of his own success. He orders them to race so deeply, so quickly. They get deep into Soviet territory. The Soviet Union was an undeveloped country at the time, lacking bridges and roads. The winter sets in. And the reinforcements bringing hundreds of thousands, ultimately millions of Nazi soldiers, their warm jackets and their food can't make it, along with the gas for the tanks and the resupplies. So yeah, Napoleon, he was a megalomaniac. By the way, Napoleon sold Jefferson the Louisiana Purchase on the cheap. And the Louisiana Purchase was not the state of Louisiana. It was basically the Mississippi River. It doubles the size of the United States. Today, the area constitutes fully 1/3 of continental US, not Alaska and Hawaii. He sold it to us on the cheap. Why? Do you remember the British blockade? Napoleon needed cash. Now, he wasn't being nice to us. His plans were, after I beat the British, I'll sail to America and take it back and take them if I want. So, yeah, his megalomania, thank goodness. Got one in the back.
Yeah, one question. During the American Revolution, you read of mutinies by soldiers who haven't been paid, and even certainly mutiny by officers who hadn't been paid.
Yep.
Don't read much about that during the War of 1812. How did Gallatin or whomever pull it off? You mentioned once that the troops hadn't been paid because Congress wouldn't appropriate the funds. So how did that work out?
Mutinies in both wars, too many of them actually. What was it, June 15th, 1783? A bunch of angry, quote unquote, patriots attacked the Capitol and busted the windows out and threatened to kill and capture members of Congress. And they urinated and defecated on the floors of the Capitol, which was at the time Independence Hall in Philadelphia. Now, why did they do that? They were veterans who weren't paid. There was a deal cut in Congress, a deal struck between Hamilton and Jefferson, right? Washington and Hamilton, of course, Adams, Henry Knox, the Federalists wanted to pay veterans. Jefferson and the Southerners wouldn't pay. So they marched. Washington almost had his own mutiny. Newburgh, which was his last headquarters on the river near West Point, everybody. That was his longest headquarters, a full 2 years. Washington was struggling with what I always call the Cold War of the Revolution, For 2 years after the Battle of Yorktown, really not a major battle. The British are in New York City right here, and we're up on the river, and a new type of enemy, boredom. They weren't paid, they were frustrated, and he almost had a mutiny there. There were mutinies in the War of 1812. The most common tactic was soldiers simply refused to march into Canada. There were several armies from New England. They got to the Canadian border and they all sat down, and then they just dropped their muskets and walked away and went home. Why? Most of them were farmers who traded with Canada. Canadians bought their beef or whatever the case may be, or they bought the fish from them. So we had multiple armies that simply went to the border and turned around and went back. So yeah, there are examples of that. We don't like to put that in the books because it doesn't make us look good, but a lot of that did happen. Yeah, good question. Yes, sir.
Earlier, you mentioned the person's name, Calhoun.
Calhoun.
Yeah, I was down south a few months ago. There's a issue going on with Calhoun Street, whether it should be renamed or not.
Yeah.
And I never heard of this guy, but when I started going back and Googling him and going into, this guy was a real dirtbag.
Oh, he was horrible. John C. Calhoun was one of the most influential members of Congress.
And some people still want his name to stay there.
I know. He makes Dr. Watson's list of the 10 worst Americans ever to live. But he was a monstrous human being. He was out for himself. He didn't care about the country. We almost had secession from South Carolina long before the Civil War. In the 1830s, he threatened to secede from the Union. Nullification crisis, if anybody heard of that. We're going to nullify every federal law. We can do whatever we want. And I can take as many slaves as I want. And we don't have laws. We can do whatever monstrous. I don't like Andrew Jackson. He's also one of my least favorite people. He was a narcissist, a rapist, a bully, a slave owner. Jackson was a monster. But Jackson was president, our 7th president, and Jackson and Calhoun didn't like one another. And at the White House, Calhoun announces nullification at a dinner, and Jackson stands up and offers a toast. And he stares straight at Calhoun, like with a De Niro stare, probably. And he says, if I hear one more word of this, I'm going to hang you and the first South Carolinian I get my hands on to the first tree I can find. And then he offered a toast, and then the South Carolinians shut up and backed down. But yeah, John C. Calhoun was a monstrous person. I guess that's a good place to kind of wrap this up. I'm an historian. I eat, sleep, and drink this stuff. I take a more nuanced view on Confederate statues, the names of slave owners, Calhoun Street, certain universities. I don't want people to just tear down the statues. I prefer a civil approach, but I don't think we should be celebrating people that attacked the United States of America. Robert E. Lee took an oath. He was a West Point grad. He took an oath, and he defied his oath, which is court-martial and death, and attacked the United States, tore up the Constitution. And the historians are now putting the number at 720,000 Americans died because of him and his cronies. I don't think we should have statues that celebrate him. Now, I don't want them torn down. I grew up near Gettysburg, love the statues on the battlefield. I differentiate. If the statue's there to educate, leave it up. If it's there to celebrate, take it down. There's a lot of museums, universities, battlefields that would love these monuments and statues, but I don't think we should have them. My first teaching job was in Alabama. And the building, the hall that my office was in, was named for a Klansman. And this was 1992. And I always said, why is this Bibb Graves, B-I-B-B, Bibb Graves? Why are they naming state university buildings after a Klansman, for crying out? There's astronauts and great jazz musicians and poets. And I mean, there's no shortage of great people to name things after, right? Same with our currency. Why is Jackson on the 20, right? There's poets and conservationists and musicians and a lot of people that could be put on. So I'm against naming something for Calhoun because he was a vicious, lying, murdering slave owner. I don't think that's who we are as a country, but let's do it in a civil manner. Let the public be involved and find creative ways of naming streets. I always go around to museums and propose, what about, naming it for great trees, redwoods, ponderosas, and down in Florida, royal palms, and there's a lot of great things we could name it after, or there's no shortage. So yeah, I
Unfortunately, there's a group of people down there who resist that.
I know they resisted. Well, we have national politicians that wanted things to be named after Klansmen and are upset that we renamed military. Fort Bragg. Bragg was a Confederate general and a Klansman and an incompetent general. Why is one of our greatest forts named after, at least pick a competent Confederate or competent slave owner, an incompetent slave owning monster? Fort Bragg. I like names like Fort Liberty and Fort Freedom and Fort Harriet Tubman and Fort Sergeant York and Fort, right? Dick Winters. A band of brothers, everybody? Yes, the great hero, Easy Company from my hometown, who was one of the great heroes in world history at D-Day. Name the fort for him. This guy was extraordinary, right? So, yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Everybody, thank you mostly for supporting Fraunces Tavern, my favorite place in the city. Thank you.
So one Zoom, there's been a lot of love for your talk and your book. They asked, where can they get your book?
Where can you get the book? I hate to say it, but they're all on Amazon, where any place where books are sold. It's called When Washington Burned. Easy name to remember, Dr. Watson, like elementary, my dear. So I've only heard that every day of my life. But When Washington Burned, it's not in paper yet, paperback, so it's hardback. They were going to go to paper, but it won, so I think they're going to wait and keep it in hardback a little longer. Unfortunately, money influences the publishing industry too. And there's copies here, or Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, or you can just go to Georgetown University Press, bypass all the .coms and the websites, and buy it directly from Georgetown University Press, supporting a good university. So, thanks.
All right, so just to close us out here, we do of course have copies of the book in the back for anyone attending in person. Thank you so much, Dr. Watson, for that wonderful presentation. And thank everyone for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. You can also find our calendar of upcoming programs there as well. And our next lecture will be next week, a week from today, on Monday, July 15th. You can also drop by every Friday this month for an all-ages hands-on craft featuring some specific historic tie-ins to the museum. Thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary era with the public. If you would like to donate, you can also do that on our website, FrauncestavernMuseum.org. Thank you all again for joining us at another Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Michelle. Yeah.